Of the many passages about which we could ask the pertinent question, why is that in the Bible? Here's another one. In 1926, a German scholar named Leonard Rost wrote what became a classic in biblical studies, and really was a kind of standard for this particular topic throughout the 20th century, although everyone and their brother and their mother has written to criticize it since. His book was called The Succession to the Throne of David. The Succession to the Throne of David. Had a different title in German. And I'll put a link to it down below, along with some other resources that I rely on to get me back up to speed on this really interesting topic. And in that book, he made an argument, and that argument was this, that there's a stretch of material in the book of 2 Kings and right at the beginning of 1 Kings that he thought was a discrete source, a very particular literary source that could be taken and sort of like placed into the narrative in order to accomplish several things. This narrative begins, let's say, around 2 Samuel chapter 9 in Leonard Rost's conception, runs all the way through 2 Samuel 20, then cuts off because you have a couple chapters at the end of 2 Samuel that he didn't think were part of this source, but then picks back up again at the beginning of 1 Kings for 2 chapters of 1 Kings in order to get Solomon installed on the throne. Okay. Now the basic idea here is that this block of text had a particular agenda. He even used the word propaganda, although when we hear that word propaganda, I think sometimes we automatically go negative on it, like that an author was doing it and was like, hey, let me try to trick everybody, or something like that. I don't know that in this context, okay, and in the context of academic biblical studies, the word propaganda could have a more technical meaning. Something like a piece of ideological literature, which again, the word ideological even sounds very negative, but again, doesn't have to. Just means trying to advance some kind of agenda, some kind of argument, has some very particular political purpose, we might say. And to that extent, we would say that all narrative is persuasive, or all narrative is propaganda, or all narrative is ideological in some way. So maybe these terms sort of become so abstract that they lose their meaning if we take their power, their critical power away from them. But at any rate, I want us not to panic when we hear the word propaganda here. But rather, Ross thought that this was a kind of motivated literature that had a purpose, okay? It was purposeful. Let's use that word instead. It was purposeful literature. And it had a theme, it had an intention, it had very specific boundaries about where it starts and where it ends. It was written at a particular time, and it had some unifying themes. So let's get into this a little bit. The theme. The theme was basically Game of Thrones, right? If you've seen the HBO series, Game of Thrones, the theme is who sits on the throne of David? Who sits on the throne and how do they get there? Okay, that's the big idea. The intention, or in German, the Tendenz, as Ross called it, was to act as a purposeful literary composition to support the ascension, particularly, and this might come as a surprise, the ascension of King Solomon to the throne. Solomon as the legitimate successor and heir of David. And thus the time period when this was written, according to this theory, it would have been written most meaningfully, most purposefully during Solomon's reign, right? In order to boost the idea that Solomon is in fact the legitimate heir. The boundaries, as I said, 2 Samuel 9, I think in the original proposal, really all the way through 2 Kings 2, but I think in the original conception, the classic conception, the last few chapters of 2 Samuel don't count. They're of a different source. Was it unified? Yes, it was unified around this pro-Solomonic theme. Okay. Now, before talking about the criticisms of this theme and whether or not we might chance to or dare to agree with it or disagree with it, let's just take a gander through the text. I'll use the text headings here in this NRSV Bible to guide us through the very complex literature and the very complex stories that we find throughout 2 Samuel. I mean, let's just take a review. Perhaps you've read this recently or perhaps not. 2 Samuel 8 ends with a kind of like a concluding statement about how David has consolidated the throne. This is 2 Samuel 8:13. David won a name for himself. When he returned, he killed all these Edomites. He put garrisons in Edom, and the Lord gave victory to David wherever he went. And he had these officers. Almost sounds like an ending, you could say, of a sort. a kind of false ending to the story of David. But it's not, of course. Many, many chapters now ensue in which we find some of the most gritty, human, political narratives in all of the Old Testament. So much so that you could read chapters and chapters of this stuff and wonder, where is God exactly in all of this? I mean, God usually a major character in these narratives. But we see a lot of stuff here where, and God does appear. I'm not saying God doesn't appear in these narratives. Of course, God does, by name as an acting character in the story. I'm just saying, a lot of this goes by and you're like, why do we have to read about this? Geez, this is like a lot. Chapter 9 begins with David showing kindness to some of Saul's relatives, Mephibosheth, particular among them. Some Ammonites and some Arameans are defeated. However, in chapter 11, infamously, the adultery with Bathsheba, the killing of Uriah the Hittite, the whole thing just dirty, dirty, dirty. People have gone as far as to say that David commits a kind of sexual assault. It is in effect a kind of rape that he commits against Bathsheba. She is choiceless in the scenario. Those are some of the most critical and strident readings. At the very least, he is unfaithful in every way. He kills an honest man. It's just a horrible, horrible scene. He's condemned by the prophet. The child of this affair dies. But Bathsheba still gets to become, I guess, part of his royal court, his wife, something like that. After this, Solomon is born. And you can see here where Rost is maybe getting this idea, the idea that this is really about Solomon, showing, even from birth, Solomon's rise to power through these chapters. The Ammonites are crushed. Amnon and Tamar, two of David's children, have a bit of a problem. Amnon falls in love with his sister. A big mixed family, so maybe it's not as weird as it sounds, or maybe it actually is. This is 2 Samuel chapter 13. People get killed. Absalom avenges the violation of his sister by killing his brother. Amnon, very, very hard stuff. Absalom returns to Jerusalem. David forgives Absalom, but then Absalom usurps the throne of David. David is forced to flee from Jerusalem. All this seems like a lot of punishment indeed, perhaps following on the affair with Bathsheba and the murder of Uriah. David gets some spies, has some adversaries. He gets cursed by this person named Shimei, who runs around throwing rocks at him. There's this counsel of someone named Ahithophel, who counsels the king, but later the counsel of Hushai, in fact, predominates over the counsel of Ahithophel, and Ahithophel takes his own life. There's the defeat and death of Absalom, who gets caught up in a tree by his hair in a very odd scene. David hears of Absalom's death, mourns a lot, ends up coming back to the throne in chapter 19, and shows some kindness to someone else. And now in chapter 20, you have the rebellion of Sheba, a scoundrel, the text calls him, who says, "We have no portion in David, no share in the sons of Jesse. Everyone to your tents, O Israel." And everyone withdraws. The whole country seems to be falling apart. Seems like we're back in the book of Judges here in a sense. And this would be then the end of the so-called succession narrative. You get some other things then at the end, exploits of David's men, a song of thanksgiving, some last words of David. But then in 1 Kings, we have another gritty political narrative that reads very much like the narratives from 2 Samuel. And maybe the boundaries of these books are an artificial product of scroll length, or the way some communities at some point in the past divided up books, but not necessarily natural endings on a literary sort of reading at least. But at any rate, 1 Kings begins with Bathsheba doing a lot of posturing and working with a certain priest to try to get her son Solomon to ascend the throne. And in fact, he does. And David instructs Solomon with some, mob boss style results, telling him kind of like, you know what to do with your enemies, which is to say, kill them. And Solomon, in fact, consolidates his reign by the end of 1 Kings chapter 2. So that is a summary right there of this succession narrative. And one can maybe see why this idea of the succession narrative had legs, had a lot of weight to it, because it does seem to narrate in a very dark and politically realistic sense, for at least for an ancient audience, and probably with some recognizable themes for the way politics works today, the downfall of David, but also his recovery, but how all of it leads inevitably to the coronation of Solomon when the right political path is followed. Okay, so this is a lot. There's a lot here. I mean, why narrate all this stuff about David? I mean, why does the narrator, after giving the promise to David in 2 Samuel 7, which promises that one of his sons will be on the throne forever with no qualifications. It's a stunning text. You should read 2 Samuel 7 sometime. Just a stunning text. Why, after that elevation of the kingship and of David, does he then have this downfall? And then how, through this downfall, does he even get to remain king? I read a recent article by a scholar at an Australian university, Rochelle Gilmore. I hope I'm pronouncing her name correctly. It's called something like Sex Scandal and the Politics of David's Throne or something like that. I'll put a link to it down below. You should really try to get access to it. It's somewhat recent, written in 2022. She makes a very interesting argument with, using a lot of political theory and also contemporary events around more modern sex scandals to argue that sometimes these types of scandals don't always do what you think they'd do. You think maybe they would emerge or be told in order to denigrate someone or trash someone, but in some ways they can have effects on an audience that are a little counterintuitive. Maybe they can show, for example, for David, the absolute inevitability and untouchability of his claim to kingship, that he can even have a scandal like that and survive it, and in fact come out on the other side. Bruised and battered, and we know now that he's all the more human for it, and that God punishes sin and all of that. But he does come out on the other end of it nonetheless. And I think in that, in thinking about that, the way the narrative seems to go on and on and on about David's failings and the failings of his family, we have to ask, is there any other ancient Near Eastern literature or any comparable literature from roughly this time period? Let's say the first millennium, I don't know. Maybe the 900s, maybe the 800s, maybe the 700s BC, a lot of scholars would say. It's hard to say when any of this was written. Is there any other comparable literature, though, that presents a king reaching such a height and seems to be propaganda, propping up that king, but then shows a downfall and shows that king being punished by the gods, not just elevated to the throne, but also punished in such a textured, nuanced, human, detailed way? I'm reminded of a quote from this book. This is a fantastic classic by Baruch Halpern, David's Secret Demons, Messiah, Murderer, Traitor, King. Worth having a look at. But I was reminded when thinking about this topic of Halpern's book, and I found the quote I wanted, which is Halpern says, in reflection on this question I'm asking, why would you narrate something in this way? He says, David, in a word, is human. Fully, four-dimensionally, recognizably human. He grows, he learns, he travails, he triumphs, and he suffers immeasurable tragedy and loss. He is the first human being in world literature, Halpern says. The first human being in world literature. I thought that was a great quote. What have the criticisms been, then, of Leonard Ross' famous idea of this succession narrative? Well, if you know anything about biblical scholarship, oh intelligent viewer, and you do if you're watching this, you know that the criticisms are basically at every single point, okay? I'll link a couple of articles down below. There's a really good long article by Andrew Knapp from a couple of years ago in the journal Interpretation, who reviews the last couple of decades of scholarship on this question, and basically just showing how everybody has come out and had some alternative idea. Mostly, I mean, one of the things that people have criticized most strongly has been this idea that the purpose of this literature was to promote Solomon. In fact, people have argued that maybe to the contrary, this whole narrative actually denigrates Solomon. Maybe it even shows, in fact, that we wouldn't even want any kind of king who participates and can get away with these kind of abuses, murder and so on, and all the intrigue and all the nonsense. And of course, we'll see as we read on in 2 Kings that Solomon, who's praised for his great wisdom in the building of the temple, is himself then shown to be an idolater and a huge sinner, which leads to the breakup of the country into two parts, north and south. And we see that eventually leads it to the destruction of the northern kingdom and in fact the destruction of the temple and the southern kingdom, Jerusalem, Judah as well. So this is clearly written by somebody who's not afraid to show the dark side of David's reign, for sure. It sits very strangely, as I said, though, with other material that seems to praise David, unless we recognize that this is maybe even intentionally a very conflicted, ambivalent human portrait of this king. Andrew Knapp makes a great point. He says, if we're supposed to see this as propaganda for Solomon, it's actually kind of bad propaganda because we can't even really figure out what it's propaganda for, and scholars find so much room to disagree about the purpose of this literature or its themes, or whether it's pro-Solomon or pro-David. It could be anti-David, pro-Solomon, could be anti-Solomon and anti-David, could be pro-Solomon and pro-David. I mean, there's so many different outlooks one could have. Andrew Knapp in the article says something like, well, I'll just quote. He says, readers do not finish 1984, the novel by George Orwell. Readers do not finish 1984 and then argue about Orwell's stance on big government. In other words, if this is a literature that had such a clear point, how is it now so unclear to us what the point is? If the author was being subtle, the author might have been a little too subtle for us to understand it, okay? Maybe though, maybe I'm suggesting what we have to accept is something like Halpern's view, that this is a deep, stunning, even revolutionary portrait of what may in fact be the first real fleshed out literary human in world literature. Maybe we have to accept the human drama and tragedy of it all. And as Bible readers, I don't think it's enough to just read this and be like, oh, the Bathsheba story, it just means don't sin or God will punish sin. Because David eventually works through it and is in fact restored on the other side of it. So already that message is more complicated. Nor do I think we can just read 1 and 2 Samuel and just be like, well, God just chose David. That's the whole point of the whole thing. Because we have chapter after chapter. I mean, if you believe in any sense, as a Christian, theologically at least, if you believe that this literature has any purpose at all, and that it's there for a reason, right? Unless you're willing to call God a bad author and say that God has just wasted our time with chapter after chapter after chapter of this very detailed and dark and strange political maneuvering. Unless you're willing to say that, I think you've got to conclude that there's some purpose here. Maybe that purpose is to show us something of this ambiguous drama around leadership. Drama that already began back in the Torah, right? With Moses' leadership and with the people's unwillingness to really accept it. And in fact, Moses himself gets shut out of the land. So the Bible takes, in a way, I don't know, a very elevated view of human leadership, certainly just the fact that there are kings, but also a very dim and suspicious and dark and complicated view as well. And I think there are a few places where you could see that better than in this so-called succession narrative.